The purpose of this video is to cover some of the basics of technical style and to give you recommendations of things that you should avoid or incorporate into your own writing in order to be more effective technically. Finally, at the end, I will model for you how to go about editing your own documents for technical style. The goals of technical writing are that readers should be able to easily skim a document, understand content quickly, and not have to reread information. One of the ways that you accomplish these goals is through your use of a good, effective technical style. Technical writing is heavily focused on an audience's needs, and in addition to technical style, you can use your formatting and visuals to communicate. We'll talk later about formatting and visuals, and we'll also continue to explore technical style throughout the entire semester. This video is meant to just give you a good overview in order to allow you to start thinking about some of the concepts that you want to continue extending and developing as the semester progresses. There's a time to edit for style. When you're drafting your document, whether it's a cover letter, a resume, or a longer report, you want to think about editing for style as something that should come later in the process. In addition, you want to very carefully distinguish between revising, editing, and proofreading. Somebody once told me that revision is with the ears, editing is with the eyes. When you revise something, often reading it out loud is very helpful. And that can also help with editing as well. But revision is where you start thinking about major issues, such as, is this organized? Does it make sense? Are the sentences in a logical order? Is there enough content? Is all the information necessary included? And overall issues with language. Is it an appropriate style? Are you using appropriate language in that way? Editing focuses on refining style. So you're working on a more minor level. You play around with sentence structure and you refine language in terms of maybe fiddling with one word rather than an overall stylistic approach. Finally, proofreading focuses on eliminating errors or typos. You want to avoid proofreading too early because if you're having to make major changes, it will mean that proofreading is essentially redundant. So keep this in mind as you approach this stage of your writing process. The last little tip in terms of revising and editing is giving your document time to breathe. Sometimes it's useful just to write something, draft it, put it aside for a bit, and then come back to it. You'll have fresh eyes and you'll be able to look at the content from a reader's perspective instead of from your own perspective. Obviously, most writing consists of paragraphs and sentences, and in technical communication, we have some rules and guidelines that might be different from what you've experienced in English 101 or 102 or more creative settings. The first is that in technical communication, you avoid overly long paragraphs. When I write academically, I often have really very long paragraphs that are a page or a little less, but in technical communication, this is not acceptable. So shorter paragraphs are often better, and partly because you're able to divide up the information in a more efficient and effective way, which helps the reader skim a document more easily. An overly long paragraph, especially if it's in a block format, can be really daunting for a reader to get through, so keep that in mind. Second is that you want to use topic sentences. Topic sentences shouldn't be new to you, and this is a feature of good writing overall, not just specific to technical communication. A topic sentence states a claim or a topic of a given sentence. It essentially announces what is going to happen in a sentence that you're going to develop in more detail, and readers can use them to skim or navigate a document. So if they're able to read the first sentence of each of your paragraphs, they should have a pretty good sense of what the document contains overall and focus in on the areas that they most specifically need the information. And the last bit in terms of sentences is that you want to think carefully about sentence length. Often in academic writing, we equate length with more complexity and therefore as better writing. However, in technical communication, sentence length should be shorter. You do want to vary the sentence length to avoid choppy or redundant feeling sentences, but you want to think about revising or avoiding overly long sentences. Another comment I want to make is in terms of brevity versus concision. Brevity is simply being brief. not using very many words. However, conciseness or concision is using the fewest number of words as needed to clearly communicate an idea. Your goal is not to be brief, but to be concise. So you can be brief but very wordy, and you can offer detail but be concise. So give detail, give information fully, yet use concise language to do so. So don't confuse writing shorter amounts with being concise. And there's a big danger in doing this. If you feel like you're not being concise because you're writing too much, you want to very carefully evaluate, is the information all necessary? If it is, then you want to think in terms of, is my style concise, and allowing the reader to very quickly and easily access this necessary information. So finally, a long list of things to avoid in your writing. And this will just start, and you'll see me comment on these when I work with you on your writing. One is what's called expletives. These are not what you normally think of as expletives, but instead the construction there is or there are. You want to avoid starting any of your sentences with there is or there are, and mostly because you can revise it to just being a little more direct. So it's often seen as what's called passive construction, not to be confused with passive voice. But passive constructions lead your writing to feel less concise. So for instance, I have the sentence, there are 3 things you should know. You could revise it to say, you should know 3 things, and then you could very quickly list those 3 things. It takes out 2 words, and it begins with the subject instead of what's essentially a dummy subject, there is or there are. Another word you should avoid is very. There's a funny little anecdote. It might be actually by Mark Twain or not by Mark Twain, but anyways, Mark Twain is purported to have said that if you look at your word or your writing and you replace every instance of very with the word damn, and then you go through and edit out all of those dams, your writing is going to be a lot better. And so anytime you see the word very, maybe just mentally substitute damn instead and see what happens with your writing. The idea here is that you're not using excess modifiers, and instead you're letting the word itself stand for what it means. So if you're finding yourself using a lot of very, maybe you find other ways of communicating the concept that uses fewer words. The next element is this without a noun. So I see this all of the time, and in fact we use it informally in communication, spoken communication, all of the time. In writing, it's unclear. So if you put this shows blah blah blah, the reader doesn't know what the this is. And in fact, anytime you write this without including a noun, I will essentially say, hey, this what? You want to be clear with the reader. And so this shows could be replaced with this figure shows or some other construction to avoid ambiguity. There's some other phrases you want to avoid, and they often start with being. So starting a sentence with being often leads to a convoluted or kind of complicated structure that could be simplified. So I see being that or with that being said as a way of starting a sentence, and it is frequently not necessary and not really helpful. And another is the overuse of is or are. When you use is or are, I mean, there's obviously cases where you have to use that, but often you can substitute with a more specific or particular noun that actually is more particular to what you needed to say, and therefore helps you to be more concise. The next is don't use pompous language or academies. We often equate overly complicated language or style with better quality. So this is often a hang-up or a leftover from other contexts. And sometimes students have been rewarded for language that is considered pompous. And so they think that that's good writing, but it really is not. So in technical communication, because your goal is to communicate clearly, if you use pompous language or academies, you're just going to confuse the reader. And if they have to reread something over and over again, it's going to be really frustrating. I have a really low tolerance for pompous language. And so if I find that the words you're using are just not appropriate for the context, I'll point that out to you and help you understand how to revise it to be clearer. It's not being simple or communicating to a lowest common denominator. Instead, it's thinking in terms of clearly communicating and avoiding ambiguity. And with that in mind, you want to think about avoiding vague language. So you can be really simplistic and essentially not give a full amount of detail. This goes back to that idea of brevity and concision. So if you're being concise, you can still be specific and be concrete. And this might be giving data or numbers or quantifying a concept. In engineering, for instance, or in the sciences in general, you always want to quantify any given concept. So if you're vague and you just say, it increased, for instance, your reader's not going to know what you're talking about. And so you have to quantify what that increase means because the context is necessary to help the reader understand what's going on. Finally, use active voice where possible. The difference between active and passive voice is that you might say something like, the paper was written, and that's passive voice. And it doesn't make any sense to keep that as passive voice, so you want to say something like, the student wrote the paper, and there you're removing the agent into the active position. Active voice is actually easier to read. International readers often find passive voice to be really hard to understand, and in general it has more words and therefore is more wordy and less concise. However, there are going to be cases where you have to use the passive voice, and so just consider carefully where possible how you can be active and where it's most appropriate to use passive voice. So that's it for this particular video. In the next video, I'm going to cover how to apply some of these strategies in a piece of writing to model for you how you can go about editing for style.